What's up, everybody? This is Professor Keegan, and this is a video for our asynchronous material for the rest of the week, and in preparation for your Sunday evening journal on our unit on individual opportunity. And so we're talking in this unit about the class structure of the United States. Last class, we talked about some of the realities of economic inequality in the United States and how our kind of national ideology about class tends to obscure those differences quite a bit. So we talked about kind of the fundamental assumptions about wealth accumulation in the United States and how we tend to separate the idea of success, winning, and wealth generation from some of the more obvious consequences on the climate, on other humans, on the environmental well-being of the planet. And so what we have is kind of a hyper-capitalist culture in which the downsides of wealth production tend to kind of get obscured. And today we're going to be adding race to that conversation because not only is our culture unequal just in terms of wealth, but as the reading from last class noted, race is definitely an accelerating factor for those differences. So when we combine race and class together, what we get is what we would call a structurally racist economy in which particularly Black folks, but non-white people in general tend to struggle more because of the way that the economy has been historically structured. And the reading and material you looked at today talked about how the United States economy was really jump-started and founded through the process of enslavement. So it was the profits that came from slavery that really did give us the modern US economy. And we still live with that economy. So I'm hoping that the reading you did in combination with the podcast took you all the way from the 1600s through the contemporary period to kind of understand just how stacked against Black Americans the US economy has been in different periods. I'm starting with this image of a Black man sitting outside a storefront where his ancestors would have been bought and sold as property. This was an auction and Negro sales block. And all over America, we still have evidence of the infrastructure of slavery as an economic system. If you look, it's there. So this history kind of hangs over us, even if we refuse to look at it. And today's content is about slowing down and thinking a bit more about the real impacts of this system, even today. So this won't be too long because I think there's quite a bit of material here for you to work with, but I do want to raise some questions and provide some structure for you before you reply. So remember that one of the things we're talking about this class, and we haven't mentioned in the last couple of weeks, but we did begin discussing at the beginning of the semester, was the idea of frames. Remember that frames were kind of like these cultural windows through which we view the world. And we talked a bit about how, an inability to get outside one's frame is one of the major things impeding critical thinking. Like, we need to be able to contextualize our own experience vis-a-vis other people's realities. And one of the really tricky things about frames is that they're largely unconscious. We don't realize that we are operating from a particular frame most of the time. And they also tend to be counterfactual, meaning that they tend to overdetermine our view to the extent that factual information that contradicts our frame, we tend to find reasons not to believe those facts. So one of the only ways to combat framing is to adopt a conscious practice of reframing. And what I mean by that is purposely taking on competing viewpoints, weighing evidence, even if we don't like it, and engaging in ethical reasoning around whether or not our frame produces ethical results. And so one thing we're practicing in this class is kind of taking on ideas that might seem outside our frame to test them and see what the results of them might be, and to then ask questions about why maybe we aren't considering these perspectives. Why are they outside our frame? So Up until this point in the semester, we've studied a lot of normative and dominant frames in US culture that actually support American mythology around a lot of things that aren't actually true when you look more carefully, right? We talked about how there's this narrative that we overcame segregation, but then when you look at how we're living, we are still very much living segregated from one another racially. So we'll be looking at a lot of instances of how dominant frames kind of get in our way of thinking more critically about the world. So some material in the course will actually be asking us to reframe our thinking rather than kind of exposing the dominant frame as insufficient or incomplete. It will offer like a new way of thinking that might test our ability to take on new perspectives. And so the reading for this week, The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, is actually presenting a lot of evidence and then asking us, based on that evidence, to adopt an oppositional frame. So we'll get to that. But I wanted to kind of just touch back on framing as a theme here in class. Now, let's talk a bit about Coates. I think the podcast is a nice supplement to Coates because it takes us back a little further in history. Coates starts us out kind of in the, I believe, late 19th century in Chicago and takes us forward about 100 years. The podcast starts us in the 1600s. It takes us forward. So they kind of meet in the middle. I want to focus on Coates because I think this piece is dense and I think it can be a little confusing what his positions are because he's laying out so many facts and so much evidence. And he's kind of he's writing about why he changed his mind about reparations as a concept. So to start out, he's noting in this piece, which is called The Case for Reparations, how despite our efforts to address racial bias and unfairness in our society, we have never been able to close the wealth gap between white and Black Americans. Some of the data we looked at in class really illustrates this, that Black people still are doing a lot worse than white Americans on a lot of key economic indicators. And we should really ask ourselves, like, despite all these efforts, if we haven't fixed the problem, then what is the reason for that? Does the problem lie in Black people, right? Which would be a way of blaming people for their problems, right? Or does the problem lie in the solutions we're pursuing? Coates is of the opinion that the problem lies in the solutions being incomplete or insufficient, and that it's not just the fault of Black people for not doing better under these conditions. What he's really talking about here is that because our society teaches us that our class status is the product of our own individual efforts, remember that's the myth of individual opportunity, that like everybody has an equal individual chance to succeed and it's a level playing field. And if we fail, then it's our own fault, right? That's a very deeply capitalist mythology that the United States invests in. The problem with that is that because we believe in this individual narrative of success or failure, the economic effects of racial injustice get made invisible by that narrative, right? Like if everyone's just individually responsible for their own welfare, then the only explanation for racial inequality on these matters is that Black people just aren't working hard enough, or they're just not committed enough to these things, right? So that explanation should trouble us. It should trouble us that that narrative is something that is used as an explanation for inequality. So Coates proposes a solution here based on a lot of evidence that he provides that would actually address the structurally racist nature of the American economy. And when I say structurally racist, I mean that there are these like built-in mechanisms that continue to kind of over time disadvantage people from certain groups. It doesn't require a bunch of like intentionally racist people to produce these structural effects because they're all linked back to like this initial structure of slavery. So reparations is this idea that in order to kind of correct for this disparity, the initial disparity in the system, we would need to, give Black Americans who were impacted by slavery generationally some kind of help to kind of get people more equalized economically. I have a quick video about reparations, just kind of explaining what it is that I'll pull you over into here.
Reparations. It's a term you've likely heard before, but what does it mean? It's a type of compensation given to a group of people who've suffered abuse at the hands of a more powerful group. In the US, it's often talked about in terms of slavery. But slavery was so long ago, and some ask, why should Black Americans be compensated now? Well, proponents argue that the US was built on the backs of slaves, and all our social institutions continue to reinforce rigid economic inequalities against Blacks. It's easy to see why. From slavery, white families got rich, bought land, and cemented legacies, while Black families were torn apart and kept in extreme poverty. From the dawn of America, the starting line for Blacks was far behind the white majority. The Emancipation Proclamation did little to end the racial stigma of being Black in America, and even less to ensure that ex-slaves could access the immense wealth that white America had accumulated off their labor. While all Americans of all backgrounds are deemed equal under the law, equality also means equal access to economic opportunity, healthcare, property, education, and justice. Black people have been systematically denied these things for the past 150 years, and not just by Jim Crow laws in the South. Every major American social institution has roots in slavery. The U.S. school system is still unequal and unofficially segregated. Teachers in minority schools make less money and are less likely to be certified. Black students are often at a disadvantage from day one, and fewer Black boys graduate from high school. 60% of people behind bars in the US are people of color, and Black men are close to 6 times more likely than white men to go to prison. Housing discrimination continues as well. Thanks to old techniques like redlining, which deny home loans and insurance to people living in certain areas, and predatory lending, Blacks have been forced to live in low-income neighborhoods and denied the chance to own homes. Oh, and then there's life expectancy. Black men die on average 5 years earlier than white men. The infant mortality rate for Black babies is more than twice that of whites. Socioeconomic factors like diet, lifestyle, and lack of preventative care all come into play here. So you'd think all of this might make our nation's leaders want to have a discussion about reparations, but you'd be wrong. Congressman John Conyers Jr. has been introducing the same bill for 25 years, calling for a commission to discuss reparations. It's been shot down every time. And while there are many obstacles in the way of distributing reparations, it's not impossible. Take Germany, South Africa, and Chile, all countries that have given reparations to groups of people their governments mistreated. And even here in the US, reparations have happened. In 1988, the U.S. began the process of reparations for more than 100,000 surviving Japanese Americans that were placed in incarceration camps during World War II. Reparations don't have to be monetary. They can be commissions for collective healing, investment in underdeveloped neighborhoods, access to skills training, or even major legal reforms. There are, of course, many questions, like who would get compensated and what specific problems would be solved. Reparations don't right the wrongs of the past, nor are they a means by which the conditions of people who've been grossly abused are somehow magically fixed. But in a country where the government has yet to formally apologize for slavery, something that began 400 years ago, isn't it time to start talking about what can be done to heal those wounds?
Okay, so take you back over to my slides. So you can see that I like that video because it touches on a lot of things that we've already kind of covered in class and shows connections between, say, redlining, educational inequality coming out of that redlining, which we've already covered, right? And then because we tie financial mobility in our culture to educational attainment, you can see then how that would create wealth, like class inequality and wealth inequality between white and Black people, and it would continue as this self-reinforcing process, which is what we mean when we call it structural racism. So Coates is saying here that he was initially a little skeptical about the idea of reparations, but as he researched about what actually happened between, say, 1890 and 1990 to the generation of Black Americans that like emerged out of the Reconstruction South and were supposed to be able to like participate equally in US society, he starts to be really convinced that like we didn't actually get rid of slavery because of all the ways that these inequalities are reproduced at the level of like economic oppression. And so he says by the end of this process that he actually is in favor of some kind of fiscal or monetary policy that would start to correct for these issues. But he goes further. He says that that will not even be enough, that we also, with that, need a set of cultural reparations, which I think the video also kind of hints at, right? For like some kind of reconciliation around slavery and what has happened to people in this country, which has never taken place. It's taken place in other countries that had like gross racial injustices in their history, but not in the United States. We haven't done that work yet. So Coates comes out of this process on board with these two ideas. So this touches on the idea of what we might call racial debt, which we're going to be looking at later in class. And so multiple kinds of debt are being discussed here. There's the financial debt owed to Black people as a result of slavery and the ensuing 150 years of discrimination that follow. There's just like, there are numbers here that we can really look at about the amount of kind of money generated from slavery and who ended up with that money, and who did not end up with any payment for their work. So there is that question. But I think another question Coates is kind of raising here when he starts talking about how money is a start, but it would never be enough, is that there's also the ethical and moral debt that the US continues to avoid confronting by denying the structurally racist nature of the US economy. And so Coates is suggesting that like the monetary debt needs to be addressed, but without this additional layer of addressing the moral debt that slavery created, we will not be able to transform the society that we have. And so both must be kind of paired together in order to kind of really, really address the problem. So throughout this reading, he is using a lot of attention to detail to illustrate how these ongoing disparities between white and Black Americans are, one, rooted in the original slave economy that the United States used to amass its wealth, right? We actually had like a civil war over who got to keep generating that wealth. So it was very important to folks even back then, and it remains like one of the foundational structures, slavery, of our economic system. Two, he's showing how the maintenance of those disparities was structural to the design of the US economy. So he takes us on this trip through the life of Clyde Ross, who came to Chicago hoping to kind of be part of this great new class of free Blacks who were going to, become integrated into white culture and the white economy. And we see all of the ways in which the system resisted his participation, and stole from him and cheated him and denied him equal access. And Coates says this happened to like generation after generation of people coming out of slavery. So we see how these structural mechanisms are put in. And then also thinking about how these disparities are not only ongoing, we know that from looking at the data, but also how the original kind of racial formations of the slave economy are continually appearing in new forms, whether, it's like, well, I mean, the main example that Coates leans on is redlining. We like to think, oh, redlining happened in like the 30s and it's over. But then he talks about like recent instances of new kinds of redlining, like during the fiscal crisis in 2008, 2010, a lot of those mortgages were like the only mortgages that Black people could get were these really bad exploitive mortgages. So even very recently, we see evidence of sort of informal redlining policy still being used. So something I want to leave you with to think about in your journal is really like the power of framing around issues like this, because as the video discusses, this idea of reparations in mainstream American culture is considered really radical. It's considered a radical idea. And I'd like you to be thinking about, like, why is it considered radical to look at these disparities and say, hey, this was unfair. We need to do something about it now. Some reasons why I think reparations gets framed as radical or impossible or just like a wild, unfeasible idea. First of all, when we talked about this last class, the myth of individual opportunity that really does animate most of our economic activity in the United States separates wealth generation from its ethical consequences. Reparations would ask us to look at the ethical consequences of wealth accumulation, and because we don't like to connect those things and look at them together. It brings up too many hard questions about the fairness or relative unfairness of our economy. Secondly, we consider reparations to be radical because we are a highly capitalistic culture that sees profit as the most important source of value. And so, you know, other types of value that might be generated from something like reparations, like more racial justice, more racial equity, a more fair economy, less poverty, right? Fewer people suffering. None of those things are treated as valuable as the profits of people who already hold a lot of wealth in our society. And so there's like a real ethical question there about how we determine value. And value is framed in US culture as being about profit and and not necessarily like people's well-being. And we've already covered three here. The third reason, because settler colonialism and slavery used the idea of race to prevent or delay the rights claims of exploited groups. So those systems were set up intentionally to make it so that people, certain groups of people, simply couldn't claim the rights to things. For indigenous people, they couldn't claim rights to the land that they had been occupying and living on for millennia. For Black Americans, slavery created a system where they could not actually claim rights to their own bodies or to their own labor. And so those rights claims are still contested even today by groups in our country, right? We have not given land back that was taken. We have not restored Black Americans' right to dignity over their bodies. We see how Black Americans are treated by the police. We see how prisons are full of Black Americans, right? Like, so we may say people are equal under the law, but if some people's rights are recognized much later in history than others, then that's a disparity. And we need to think about why we continue to see these effects even now. A fourth reason why reparations is considered radical is because Americans live in highly segregated geographies. And because we're separated from one another, we do not tend to see the problems of other racial groups as our problems. Race is a really great way to divide people up and to get people to not care about each other. And so, you know, I think particularly white Americans don't look at the problems of African American people and think, those are my problems too. We don't look at the plight of, say, poor Black children and think, that could be my kid, right? Race separates us. It's a frame that gets us to look at other people as unconnected to us. And so we have all these people really struggling, and we don't think about, you know, well, those are my, that could happen to me. Whiteness is about that not happening to us. And then, so what I'd like you to think about, and again, remember, we are thinking about ethics in this class, getting a bigger frame around this is to ask ourselves, I think particularly if we are white, how might racial reparations actually benefit white people? Like, what are the sources of value here that would improve white people's experience in the United States? That would maybe make our relationship to the nation more ethical. I think it's something to really consider, because the current framing frames reparations as first, radical and impossible to achieve, and secondarily, like only a loss for white Americans. And I just don't really actually think that's necessarily true. I think white Americans might stand to benefit a lot from reparations to the extent that we might end up with a more just and fair society where what we have is more a direct reflection of what we deserve. So maybe be thinking about that a bit for your journal. I'm really curious to see what you thought of this material. I think a lot of high school education really overlooks this period between sort of like the abolition of slavery and World War II, which is a really important time in US history where a lot of these racialized mechanisms get put in place. Okay, so I will stop this video there and I'll look forward to seeing what you come up with in your writing.